have been people, like when I was starting out, there must have been a lot of people around who remembered that service, but either I never asked or they never told me. And now, another regret, which now I can't imagine that there would be anybody left who remembers that, because it's 80 years since that passenger service ended on that line. And that was the end of the Lackawanna, except that part of it still exists. They cut it back to Succossuna, but from there up to the junction, as far as I know anyway, it still remains. Just to fill in a little of the back history, I mentioned briefly the Morrison Essex, which is the name for this. Goes down, originally it started out in Newark. It went from Newark to Morristown. It reached Dover in 1848, and it reached Hackettstown 1854. And then they hoped to extend the Morrison Essex out to Pennsylvania to hook up with the Lackawanna, which was, at that time, the DL&W was only a Pennsylvania railroad. So they were hoping to go from Hackettstown somewhere here and get to Pennsylvania. And they were outsmarted by a man named John I. Blair, who built the Warren Railroad and sort of stole it out from under their noses. And he built this is the Warren Railroad, coming down through Oxford and Delaware, New Jersey, down to there. And this is the backstory, like the overhead story for what's going on in Chester. Chester is sort of a sideshow. Hate to reveal that information, but it's the way it is. So after John I. Blair built that railroad, the Lackawanna then came down from Scranton all through here and made a connection at Hampton Junction with the Jersey Central, and used that to go all the way down to Elizabeth, to Tidewater, where they could ship their coal primarily. So that left the Morrison Essex in much weaker shape, because they hadn't been able to capture that distant traffic. Later on, they did build a branch out to Phillipsburg in the late 1860s, so that helped a little bit. But they had lost the chance to become the dominant railroad, and eventually the Lackawanna took them over. So that's how the Lackawanna came into New Jersey, by taking over the Morrison Essex all the way down to Newark and then to Hoboken. And that's why it remained a division. They called it the Morrison Essex Division of the Lackawanna. But instead of the Morrison Essex being the dominant railroad, it then was controlled by the Lackawanna. Then the Central of New Jersey became the powerful railroad. But then again, there was another upheaval. In 1868, the Lackawanna actually took over the Morrison Essex, because it had been, as I said, weakened. They took control of it. And 1868 is right in the middle of this key period in Chester that I've been talking about, and that was the turning point or critical point in railroad history. So the Chester branch of the Lackawanna was really the Chester people, Daniel Budd and any of the other local people, apparently were not able to raise the money by themselves to build this rail line. And it was only when they brought in the Morrison Essex and then perhaps the Lackawanna that they were able to raise enough money to construct the Chester branch. So it never operated independently as the Chester Railroad. It was always part of the Morrison Essex, and then in turn part of the Lackawanna. So after doing that, then the tables had turned again, and now the Jersey Central is in a weakened condition, because the Lackawanna, by controlling the Morrison Essex out to Washington and then hooking up with the Warren Railroad, had its own route going to the coast, and they didn't need the Jersey Central anymore. So the Jersey Central got itself in trouble. There was a brief period when the Lackawanna and the Jersey Central tried, merged, in effect. It was like a marriage of convenience. They got together and tried to operate as one railroad. People called it the Grand Central at that time. But that didn't seem to last very long. Then they went their separate ways. The Jersey Central went into or close to bankruptcy, whereas the DL&W remained generally a prosperous railroad. It was controlled by Samuel Sloan, who was a real penny pincher, and he wrung every cent he could out of it, and made it profitable. The other thing in the larger economy going on in this period is that in 1873 there was one of these periodic, what they called financial collapses, which led to a serious depression that lasted, they called it the panics. They were all called panics. So this was the panic of 1873, where all of a sudden money dried up, and there was followed by a depression that lasted several years. Now that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore because the Federal Reserve controls the money supply. So anyway, it was difficult to raise money, and that's probably one reason why the Highbridge branch was not able to build the long route from Highbridge immediately, because money was in tight supply until at least 1876, as we saw. So that's like, I told you the local story first, and then the overhead portion later on. So it could have been done the other way. I don't know which would make more sense. Anyway, so that's pretty much how the Chester got its rail network. And for a town of this size, considering that the iron industry had died out pretty much by 1900, Chester had surprisingly good rail service. I want to go back to the Chester route, the Furnace Railroad slide. There we go. So the remaining question is when these different lines were discontinued. There was one more piece of track that was built, which is, sorry, could you go back to the other map just for a second? There's this, from Chester Depot on the central, there was this Chester Hill branch extension that ran behind all the buildings on Main Street and then crossed Oakdale Road. Carmen Smith used to keep an eye on that section. I remember talk about what was going on up there all the time. And that was built to serve this whole string of mines, which, because of the way the iron was deposited, all lay in pretty much a straight line, and in fact went all the way on into Randolph Township, but they never extended the track that far. So this was built in 1881 and was pretty active for a while. You could still see traces of it here and there, but because that ridge is really quite flat, it didn't require extensive grading, so it's difficult to pick that rail line out. And then, of course, in the village where it runs behind everyone's house, it's almost it's blended back into the landscape. So that was in service for some years, beginning 1881. Yeah.
Where did that end?
It went up as far as I think it's called Keene Mine, or maybe Squire Mine, one of them, up on that ridge. It could have gone further. It could have gone all the way into Randolph, and I think they thought about doing that, but never did. So with most things, it's easier to find out when something was started than when it was ended. People are happier with beginnings than endings. So it's difficult to know the exact day that branch was torn out, but it was gone before 1900. And this piece, once the furnace closed down at the end of the 1880s, this connecting piece from here up to the DL&W was also discontinued, and that probably was done sometime in the mid-1890s. The Hacklebarney branch continued a little bit longer because it had some other traffic besides iron, and also they kept thinking, there was a company called the Chester Iron Company that continued to hope that they would revive iron mining in Chester even as late as the World War I period. They still had some hope of reviving that. So they kept the branch open, and it also hauled a little bit of ice and lumber occasionally, but really not enough to justify keeping it in service. So somewhere around 1900, there too we were never able to pin down the exact date, they removed the entire Hacklebarney branch. So that left only the two rail lines that we remember sort of in historic memory, which is the CNJ coming up to here and the Lackawanna coming up to there. So those were the final two railroad branches in Chester. One more time to the furnace map. There we go. So I guess I want to leave you with this mystery. Maybe someone could try to solve what's going on with these different grades and how that happened, why it looks the way it does, or how they operated it. You know, they did operate it, and the trains didn't jump up and down the steps. So, and how did it work, and what's going on with this bridge? As I said, I did a lot of research. Francis Greenidge did a lot of research, and obviously no one has ever come up with the answer. Even if I was still living in this area and doing this kind of research, I would be hard-pressed to know where to look anymore. It's almost a matter of luck that some stray letter would have to turn up that is not previously known. Maybe there is a piece of paper like that in the Chester Historical Society that has been overlooked. There's always that hope. So I encourage you to try to look for it. So I guess maybe I will conclude the formal presentation here and leave time for questions or discussions. So don't ask me to explain that because I've already said that I can't. But any other questions like what's it all about, or the meaning of life, or what are we doing here, I'll be happy to answer.
First of all, thank you very much, Larry. Larry, please first.
Let me just say that there are so many new trails in the area that Larry's talking about. Through Chubb Park, and the Patriots Path has now been cut right through the furnace area. So that's a piece of country that used to be almost impenetrable. So you folks can go and experience what Larry's talking about just by getting yourself a little Patriots Path trail map and go at it. I mean, this is we're going over the edge of recorded history, as Larry has talked about. So go out there and investigate yourselves.
Thanks. You want to put up the furnace picture, let people look at that?
Yep.
I think this gentleman.
Yeah.
Question.
Sure.
Chester branch peel off the high bridge CNJ, because the main high bridge line is well north, across to north of Chester. Where was the actual Chester branch peeling off? Down in Middle Valley?
No, in Long Valley.
Right in Long
The
Valley?
junction was right in Long Valley, right at the station, pretty much.
Oh, right at the
Or
station?
Jeremy Valley, very near it, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And then they had to cross the river and climb up the hill through a cut. It was a very difficult piece of railroad. That's why I said if it hadn't been for iron, I can't imagine anyone would bother doing that.
Yeah.
Ma'am?
What was the procedure?
Please speak up, Joan.
What was the procedure to acquire the land to build these tracks?
The railroads had to purchase it, and they owned it in fee simple, the same way that you own your house lot.
Purchased it.
And a lot of people believe that there's some automatic reversion clause, that if the railroad is discontinued, the land reverts to the previous owner. And that is not true unless it's written into the particular deed. So this is why remember I mentioned that the Chester Railroad had to get a state charter, and the reason is that once they were chartered by the state, that gave them the same right that the state had to condemn land. In other words, if someone like Nathan Cooper didn't want to sell a right-of-way across his land, they had the right to condemn it in spite of his wishes. That was why they needed railroad charters. But good question. Yeah,
Was there a narrow gauge mule powered railroad?
there was one, yeah, I should have, where's Joe? Could you bring it? I'll show you on, one of the maps.
Other way.
Keep going. Yeah, there we go. There was at least one of that narrow gauge mule powered railroad, which is this, I think is what you're talking about, John. From Hacklebarney, it went down to Langdon Mine. It was operated by a man named Langdon, and it was powered by animals as far as I know, and it was narrow gauge. You know what I mean by narrow gauge for non-rail fans? So they would bring the ore up to there at a somewhat higher level and offload it onto the standard cars on the Hacklebarney branch, really only for a couple of years. The strange thing is, at least years ago when I was doing this research, you could still see where that happened. It was very clear. So that's another little piece of Chester railroading.
Two things actually. There were some local firefighters in the area, and of course Edge's mine is filled with water. They sometimes go back there and drain it for their pumpers, and two of the people I met said there's a small steam engine in that mine area that you see when you clean the water well. It's interesting.
Well, there's,
Larry, could you repeat the comment?
the question had to do with Hedges Mine, and when the water is drained out of it periodically by the fire department, there's a story that there's an old small steam locomotive at the bottom, which may be, there's no way to know. All I can say is that everywhere you go in this country, there are steam locomotives underwater. So if you believed every one of those stories, there'd be hundreds of them. And, maybe there are, but
Also too, I live in the Hacklebarney area on State Park Road, and my neighbor, there's remnants of what I think was an inclined railroad. They used to run up the hill to the mines on his property. There's even machinery and a pulley system still left up there. Is that a possibility?
yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the pictures shows
I can
something like
address that
that.
a little bit. There are workings that are up on the west side of the road.
Right.
There's all private property up there. If you take a look at your big maps, there's a big open cut, and there's a track that ran from that open cut to the side of the gorge, and then a large trestle that led to an ore roaster. And there's a picture of that ore roaster that exists. So that may be what the track didn't go up the hill, but it was up the hill and came to the edge.
Yeah, because the mines in that situation were higher than the river valley, so the ore had to come down.
And this is just a comment, but
Yeah.
in the mid-20s, my mother, children from Chester went to Roxbury High School, and my mother lived out on Parker Road. A bus picked her up, took her down to Chester Station, and they took the train into Roxbury, the high school.
Successful. Yeah, that was commonly done. And, the trolleys did that too when they existed, and they usually had special rates for school children. They didn't pay the full
I
fare.
don't think they paid, I think Chester paid.
Well, I mean, yeah, the town paid, but they paid at a lower rate.
Chester kids use that.
Right. Yeah, Chester went to Roxbury until almost 1960, I think, wasn't it? And where I lived in Ironia, they also went to Roxbury, and I was like in the first or second year that went to Dover. It changed at that point. Randolph didn't have a high school either, until much later.
I was just wondering, I've been doing a lot of research on the,
Good for you.
on horseback, on the trails, the rail trails up in Sussex County.
Yeah.
We do the Sussex branch right into Branchville and have something to drink, whatever, and then go back to the farm.
I wrote a book about that.
About the Sussex branch?
Sure.
Really?
Yeah, it's called Lackawanna Railroad in northwest New Jersey, and part of that covers the Sussex branch.
Ah,
But that's one of the books that's no longer in print.
all right. So anyway, I know that where we are, there were creameries
Yeah,
and places like that all along the railroads. Now, there had to have been dairy farming down here too.
yeah.
So did that also happen with these two railroads? Milk trains?
Yeah, I think it did, especially with the Lackawanna, because they could get it out faster. Not as much as Sussex County, Sussex County, like Vermont was really a big activity. Down here, not quite as much, but yeah, there was some of that going on. They had a creamery, the Lackawanna had a creamery down around Harrison, I think, I forget the name of it. They took a lot of milk down there from all over the commuter area. So that's what they would do. The farmers would have these milk cans, and every morning, very early, they'd bring it down to the first train, and they'd hook it up and run special milk trains down to the big creameries, and then bring the empties back for the farmer to refill the next day. That's how things were done. Yeah.
On Route 10, near one of the malls, it was a live crossing Route 10. I know where it went towards Dover, but where did it go the other way?
That was the Highbridge branch.
Hackley.
No,
Highbridge.
that's the Highbridge branch. In other words, the Highbridge branch that came up from Highbridge to Long Valley and then had the branch to Chester, it continued on as far as Rockaway, and it hooked up with the Ogden Mine Railroad. There's another, bring that up, I guess. The Ogden Mine Railroad, Mount Hope Mineral, and Hibernia in the Iron District. So here's the Highbridge branch. This is beyond the point you're talking about, so it comes up to Wharton, to Dover, and on to Rockaway. And then you have the Hibernia mine, the Mount Hope Mineral, and Wharton and Northern, and the Ogden Mine branch all fed into it.
There was a line that went into Picatinny, into the arsenal.
Yeah.
Was that part of the Wharton?
Yeah, Wharton and Northern, which is,
It's not drawn on that map, but it came, yeah.
Because we used to call it the Wharton and Snorton.
yep, probably true. So that was, yeah, that's why it was possible to write a book that I did called Iron Mine Railroads, because there was this whole network of them. Chester was just a small part.
From Dover, it was possible to go on a DL&W to Chicago.
Yeah,
I know because I did it.
yep. Yeah, they generally they would go out to Buffalo and then out to Chicago on what they called at that time the nickel plate. They had an agreement with the nickel plate sometimes.
And it goes over a huge, what do they call it?
Viaduct.
A huge viaduct.
Yeah.
It's very, very tall.
Nicholson, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, there's one in Pennsylvania, and then there's the big bridge over the Delaware, and then the,
Well,
it's
this is
called,
by Andover or something.
yeah, Andover. Yeah, that's also in my book, Lackawanna Railroad, Northwest New Jersey. That's what they call the cutoff, which is this here. Goes up here and over. It cut off the old line. The old line went all the way down to Washington and then back up, and this cutoff just went straight across everything. They cut and they filled and they had a tunnel, whatever it took. The landscape was no issue to them. They just blasted through it. That was how powerful
If
and
you go
prosperous.
up Route 206 towards Newton now, you go underneath that.
That's right, yeah. And you go under that Andover viaduct. And the Lackawanna Railroad was so prosperous and so successful that they built that out of accumulated earnings without having to borrow money. There were no bonds issued for it.
Who did the labor on the Chester grades and so on? Where does that labor come from?
Everybody hear the question about the laborers? Especially with the later ones, a lot of them were built by immigrants who were hired just to do that, do this manual labor. So a lot of them were recent arrivals, such as Italian immigrants who were hired and brought out to the area. They probably had no idea where they were. They had a shovel and they worked, and that was it. Every once in a while, maybe some of them stayed, but more often than not. And that went on even into the 20th century, where they were getting like $1 a day to do that kind of work and live in these tar paper barracks.
My grandfather was part of that.
Really? What country was he from?
Sweden.
Sweden.
He came to the coal mines in Nichols and Pennsylvania first, and then he transferred over to the railroad when they made the big viaduct up there, the Manachunk or whatever. Across Nichols and Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah.
Delaware, Lackawanna is a huge.
Yes, the Tucanic Viaduct.
Tucanic,
That's what it
yes.
is. Yeah.
Also too, I heard back in the day that Middle Valley and Long Valley had a huge charcoal industry. Was there any chance that they would have hauled the ore and the High Bridge branch to the furnaces in Chester?
Sure. I mean, any place they would get, any place they made charcoal, which was pretty commonly done. Hey Joe, any comment about charcoal? He's more the expert on
The
that.
area, the time period that we're talking about here is pretty much beyond the charcoal iron industry period. They had learned in the 1840s how to build a blast furnace that could use anthracite coal, but even by this period they were using coke.
Oh, okay.
And so they cut timber for charcoal all over North Jersey, but and they were still using it in bloomery forges as late as the 1880s, but pretty much charcoal was not an industrial fuel any longer.
It was in specialized use, but not general use. That's the difference.
Joe, are these maps available?
They will be available in the libraries.
Which ones are yours?
Yeah. I've been asked to supply them, and they'll be part of a collection.
Okay, good. So you can solve them.
Any other?
Are the tracks all gone now? That are right here?
There are no tracks. The Chester Branch track is in existence as far as Succasunna, the last time I heard. And there are no tracks left anywhere in Chester Township.
Well,
not quite.
in the 40s, my grandmother lived at the end of Furnace Road, and we used to go up Four Bridges Road, and there was where the train went across there. And my cousins and I would take a walk, and we'd walk way down over the tracks. And then my cousin would yell, "Oh, there's a bear!" And then we'd run like that.
Well, that was the Jersey Central, which remained until 1962. And somewhere after that, they removed the track. Maybe there's a straight
It's
piece
not
somewhere.
there now, that's
No.
because I looked for it, but it was.
But there's no, not only there's no operating track, but as far as I know, there's no remaining pieces of rail anymore.
Larry, the Morgan Northern still has the rails on it from Lake Junction to the Arsenal. They just never took them out. The Arsenal thought that they might want to use that right away.
That could be.
Different areas, as you're riding down the road, you can see these different kilns where they cooked lime. Was there any lime shipments going on out of here or anything of that nature?
Yeah, no reason not to. Any place that was accessible to a railroad, that's the kind of thing that railroads do.
Yeah.
So sure, could have been done.
Maybe one last question, and then we'll give Larry a break.
There still are places where you can find old railroad ties. You probably know the old railroad, the rail track from Pleasant Hill Road to Dendel. You go the other way, parallel to the river. There is a right of way, and here and there you can find railroad ties. If you cross 206, and again there is about half a mile where the trail is very recognizable with old railroad ties, and then it peters out.
That's true. Sometimes they left the ties behind because by then they had no value, but generally they took the rail up because that had some scrap value. And often, when I was a kid, I used to walk along the former Chester branch, And that's how I probably got interested in this whole strange subject. And I would pick up pieces of hardware, you know, old spikes and nuts and bolts. That was very common in those days. And because when they took the track up, they didn't save that stuff. They just tossed it aside. And probably there's still some out there if you go look for it. The other thing you sometimes find is that in the old ties, they had date nails. They would put a nail in that had 2 digits, like 5-1, and that would indicate that it was installed in 1951. And so if they gave it a certain lifespan, they would know to replace it like 40 years later. But after a while, they stopped doing that, so those are now collectible items.
Great. Anyway, please, we have refreshments. I'm sure Larry and Joe would be more than happy to answer further questions. Thank you for coming to this morning's program. Good job.
Thanks. Nobody asked me about the meaning of life. It was disappointing.
There's a bridge that crosses 206 up in Flanders. It's a railroad.